But first, a new Liberal leader was elected unopposed today, and as Peter Dutton faced the Canberra Press Gallery, make no mistake, the era of Labor-lite Liberals was over. It was a message of clarity that the Liberal Party base have been waiting years to hear, and loud and clear it came today.
By the time of the next election in 2025, we will have presented a plan to the Australian people which will clean up Labor's inevitable mess and lay out our own vision. We won't be Labor-lite. We'll propose strong policy to make the lives of Australians better and to provide more security to them. Our policies will be squarely aimed at the forgotten Australians in the suburbs across regional Australia, the families and small businesses whose lot the Labor Party will have made more difficult. Under my leadership, the Liberal Party will be true to our values that have seen us win successive elections over the course of the last quarter of a century.
Most people know Peter Dutton from his time as Border Protection Minister and more recently, of course, in Defence. But what a lot don't know is his personal story before he entered Parliament back in the middle of the Howard era.
And I grew up in a working class suburb with two loving parents who were hard-working, small business people. My parents worked hard for every dollar and we weren't financially well off. I started part-time work in a butcher shop after school and until I started university. I saved and bought a house at 19 and built a business from nothing to ultimately employ 40 people. I was a police officer for 10 years and I've dedicated my working life to public service, and I'm passionate about the protection of children and women, particularly the protection against sexual assault and harassment.
Now, those who want to say that as a Liberal Party Conservative, he won't be able to connect with families out in the suburbs, forget that this is the very basis of his own seat in Dickson. A working class, aspirational part of Brisbane, Dickson is the sort of electorate where people hope that if they work hard, they'll get ahead. The same sort of seat the Coalition has got to win right across the country if it's going to reset and get back in the game.
I've held a marginal seat for 2 decades and I know how to work with people and how to achieve outcomes for local communities. I know how to campaign. I've been the Assistant Treasurer to Peter Costello and held ministries in the Howard, Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison governments. I've served on the National Security Committee and the Expenditure Review Committee and the Leadership Group in 2 governments. My greatest honour was to represent the men and women of the Australian Defence Force, the Australian Signals Directorate, the Australian Cyber Security Centre, the Australian Federal Police, ASIO, the Australian Border Force and AUSTRAC.
When asked his position on a raft of policy areas, straight off the bat, Dutton didn't flinch. In a style I think that most Liberal supporters will find refreshing, he was candid with none of the spin of his predecessor. On the contentious issue of the Indigenous voice to the Parliament, he was cautious and said he would wait until the Albanese government showed its hand. But again, in a surefire sign he'll truly be a Liberal leader with substance, he went further and added this.
I want there to be practical solutions and I want to work with the government to deliver those. But I want them to work hand in glove. You know, going to a meeting here in Canberra and giving 10 acknowledgements to country, that's fine, and I don't say that in a disparaging way. I want to know how it is we're going to support those kids and how it is that we're going to get higher health outcomes and infant mortality rates, more kids through university, just to finish primary school and secondary school to start with. And that's the perspective that I bring to it.
Substance, not symbolism. Now, given the likelihood that Richard Marles, the new Deputy Prime Minister, will keep up his push to get the defence portfolio, even after highly concerning revelations about his strong pro-China position, Dutton didn't back down. Even in the face of a voter backlash in some seats, the new Liberal leader was frank about what's ahead of us and our region.
Went out pretty hard on the China issue. The evidence appears to be that you lost the votes of Chinese Australians. If you look at some of the seats that were lost, you went pretty close to accusing people on the Labor front bench of treason, almost. Are you going to attempt to temper some of that language, or there's no backing down? You're still going to go hard on the China issue?
I have had the benefit of the briefings in the National Security Committee and obviously at a higher level in some circumstances as Defence Minister. The issue of China under President Xi is the biggest issue our country will face in our lifetimes. I've made strong statements in the past and I don't resolve from those because I feel very passionately about this issue.
That was a pretty polite slap down to the media that you don't know what I've been told by our intelligence agencies. Now, how refreshing it was to hear that Dutton's view on China will remain shaped by our national interest and what the experts have told him rather than reshaped just to chase votes. As the former head of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Peter Jennings, told this program last week, the China issue is serious and it'll be the biggest challenge of our generation.
Things are bad because Australia, under any government, is not going to be prepared to submit to being dominated by China.
Chided by the ABC's partisan Bother-boy-in-chief Andrew Provan that voters won't like him because he wasn't warm, that he didn't smile enough, well, Peter Dutton set him straight.
All I would say is that I'm not going to change, but I want people to see the entire person that I am. And I want people to reserve and make their own judgments when they meet me. I've been in a community now, you know, nationally Labor electorate. I've won that electorate 8 times in a row. And people on the ground can see in a more wholesome way who I am. You know, hopefully you could tell a different story, that I'm not as bad as the ABC sometimes might report.
Now, as good as today's first effort was, that's all it was. Day one and a long road back for the Liberals, but it was at least a sign that the old Liberal Party is still there and Peter Dutton is determined to return to the fundamentals and the forgotten people. He's not, for example, someone who'll have his head turned by the Teals or by the obsessions that have derailed some of his predecessors. And he was quick to put the newly elected Nationals leader David Littleproud back in his box, who only minutes earlier signalled he had a bit of an open mind on Labor's legislation for climate targets that are almost double that by 2030 from what the coalition took to the election.
In terms of policy on climate, I'm a very passionate believer in making sure that we have the appropriate response to the issue of our emissions reductions. We need to do it in a sensible way, and we will have obviously our shadow cabinet meeting. So this is day one of a 3-year journey. We'll go through the party room and respect all of those processes before we announce any change to that policy.
Right answer, but mark my words, Littleproud is closer to the Greens than any Nationals leader I've ever seen. He's a bloke that's only ever known government, with public servants to hand him a brief to tell him what to think or someone to give him a speech to tell him what to say. Given he only arrived in the Parliament very recently and quickly promoted by Malcolm Turnbull, which tells you more about his philosophy than anything else. Opposition's tough, and the Liberals have got a lot of soul-searching and rebuilding ahead. Still, they're far better off in the hands of Dutton, a Liberal who's never forgotten who he is and what the party stands for, than anyone else in the party room. Where others have balked, perhaps at a headline like this in the West Australian today, Mr 19%, I reckon Dutton would have taken heart. After all, John Howard had won pretty much the same, 18%. Look how that one turned out.